The nicest seaside restaurant in Gloucester looked about the same as the last time they'd dined there with Neil and Meredith. The big dining room was glass from floor to ceiling on 3 sides. Outside, a giant teakwood deck hosted casual drinkers at wooden tables and L-shaped couches facing the ocean. Tom had reserved one of the semicircular booths that lined the inland back wall of the restaurant. They had dressed up a bit. Celia wore a black sheath dress with a piped half jacket. Tom looked dashing in his dark suit and an aquamarine tie. The room was about 3/4 full, so the hubbub of conversation wasn't overbearing. They took their seats in the deep, curved banquette around the half table. If her marriage had still been good, and she'd still been in love with her husband, it would have been the start of a lovely evening. He ordered steak, as usual, while she had the haddock casserole. They sipped wine and chipped back and forth about nothing like married folks do. Who would they call soon to catch up with? When was the chimney guy supposed to come? Their dinners came. As Celia contemplated her fish, which looked fine, she felt a sudden blip on her Tom radar. She realized this wasn't just a dinner out. This was an ambush. "So," Tom said, leaning over the plate a bit, "I talked to Jerry Pearson." Celia blinked at him. "Did you?" she said. He nodded. "I wish I'd been there to see your face. I've actually never been up to Skowhegan myself, but I imagine a massive, freezing cold barn with, horse collars hanging on the walls." It was very smart of Tom to stage this conversation with her in a public place, a classic lawyer's tactic, put the parties in a setting that inhibited angry outbursts. Now that the moment to confront him had arrived, she realized she wasn't quite sure what to say. The call to Warden Skilling had diffused her worst fears, mostly, but she was still dealing with an ocean-going container ship full of conniving crookedness. Before she could pick a place to start in on him, Tom surprised her by chuckling. He shook his head in chagrin. "I always knew I'd have to tell you about that self-dealing someday," he said, picking up his wine glass and winking at her ruefully over the rim. "It made you feel good while it lasted, though." "What? What the hell?" "Sorry," she said. "You've lost me, Tom." "Well, what I mean is, making you feel successful was the whole point. I used to watch you get so excited when the shop did well, and so bummed out if you had a slow month. I hated to see you going through those down feelings. We talked about it, remember?" She shook her head. "I don't know, maybe. Years ago. Remember how I used to beg you not to let it fuck with your self-esteem? I used to say, 'Don't let transient bumps in the road throw off your confidence.'" He stuck a forkful of potato in his mouth and talked as he chewed. "If you think back, you might notice that in the slow times there'd be a sale right at the end of the month, nothing huge, just enough to pick up your mood, you know?" He wiggled his eyebrows at her. "It was all we could afford at the time." She cleared her throat. "Are you saying you bought my antiques to improve my sales?" He nodded. "That business is your touchstone. When it does well, you do well. My only regret was that I couldn't move the needle more. I couldn't get that much for the stuff at auction, so the funds were limited. But that was before Neil came into the picture." "What?" Celia tried to block the numbness she felt crawling up her spine by taking a pull on her wine. "At some point I mentioned something to him about what I was doing. He found it very touching. He told me how impressed he was with you, how hard you worked. And, of course, he loved your style." Tom smiled at her. "Like me, he had great taste in women."